At first glance, this piece looks like a mosaic sculpture with thousands of glass beads catching the light, almost like a shattered window pieced back together. But underneath all that is something a little softer, more flexible, and remarkably sturdier. Today I'll walk you through the creation of this three-headed crow doll, a multimedia art piece built from felt and thread, transformed with over 4,000 hand-stitched beads and a coating of nail polish. When approaching an art piece like this, it may be tempting to dive in head first, spilling beads everywhere and figuring it out as you go. But when dealing with sculptural art, I found it's far more manageable to break the project down into sections, which I've outlined in chapters below. Today's project is crows. Also, I've never made a crow. So without further ado, let's get started with a base bird, a quick and simple foundation on which to build. After tracing the bird profile onto some black felt and cutting it out, we now have 2 of 3 panels of the body, with the belly panel being able to be a little more loosey-goosey as we can hold it and trace it in place, and then trim it as needed before stitching the 3 seams. We have a bird shape, a little bird belly, other bird shapes, either by hand or with a sewing machine. Then flipping it inside out like a pillow, leaving the head and tail open to receive the skeleton. Looks like a seal. This is just the base doll, and I will be building on top of this base doll pretty significantly. So much so that this base hopefully isn't even visible. Whatever you're making to be a base for you is creating the shape of what you're making. So if you make a wonky base, then you're just gonna have a wonky shaped thing. Should I be measuring it? Almost certainly. Am I going to? It'll be fine. This skeleton is made by cutting 3 lengths of armature wire and twisting them together, so one end has 2 strands and the other 3. I then snipped 2 small leg holes and inserted the wire skeleton. There it goes. Reinforcing the holes with thread to prevent the fabric from stretching over time. We now have a very vaguely bird-shaped lump. How incredibly exciting is that? Time to get stuffing. I stuffed this new little body with fabric scraps and then used the tail slit to add some fishing weights. Ignore the fact that I forgot to do this till later in the process. We're currently weighting his booty because once all is said and done, his head is gonna be weighed down by far too many beaded thoughts, and he'll just tip right over without a little weight in his bum. Like a sausage, like a little sausage casings. Finally, I sewed the tail end closed and moved on to the hydra necks by sewing tubes from more of the base felt that fit over the 3 neck wires. We've now sewn tubes with the intention of slipping them over the wires so they become a graceful long necks and beak holders and heads, technically. Stuffing them with polyfill and hand sewing the neck fabric onto the body, forming most of the fabric base of my little friend. It almost feels like a time-consuming cheat code because you can just do so much with hand sewing. The final bits are 2 sewn wing blanks. I chose to sew these like pillows so that they would fit over additional armature wire threaded through the body. Just had to trim the seam allowance here so I could actually flip this wing inside out. I left this wire in the holes to preserve the opening throughout the build process. However, when I'm ready to sew the wings on, I'll swap it out for a new length, as the original will have endured a considerable amount of strain. Now that I have a base, it's time for the beaks and feet. Both are made using Apoxie, a 2-part synthetic clay that has a bonding power of 2-part epoxy, while curing hard and sandable, much like polymer clay. Gloves are important with Apoxie. So 30 minutes, sticky and most adhesive, 1 to 2 hours, easy to work with. 2 to 3 hours setting up formable detail, and 24 hours hard cured and waterproof. Let's start with beaks so that I can fully close up the body. These are formed by taking Apoxie and shaping 3 cones a little longer than we'll eventually want the beaks to be, and then letting them cure for a few minutes until they're a little less sticky. Next, I sectioned off the desired beak length, knowing that I can break off the excess cylinder later. I'll use my clay tools to impress details like a chiseled beak line and nostrils before setting the beaks aside overnight. Then I can pop them free in the morning, taking advantage of the fact that the drying sticks were the same diameter as the neck wires, so attaching the beaks to the crow will be fairly straightforward. I trimmed back the excess neck fabric, stuffing, and cut the wire to length before gluing the beak onto each stem with a touch more Apoxie, and then running a bead of Apoxie along the rim of the beak to press the neck fabric into to help seal it off. This is reinforced by sewing around the fabric along the glue line to hold it nice and tight while it cures. Our beaks have been glued on. The fabric is attached. Isn't this the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? I mean, look at them. Absolutely stunning. Before moving on to the beaks, I laid down a base layer of felt and now they look like old women eternally in mourning. Using a dry felting needle, repeatedly stabbing the doll to sculpt the shape of the bird by layering felt where needed, such as around the drumsticks. To form the head, I made a slight crick in the neck and layered felt over it to bulk out the head and cheeks. This provides surprising flexibility for head positioning once the piece is all finished. With that done, I moved on to the feetsies by building a structure of wire. I cut new lengths of armature wire and fit them over the legs, bending them back to form the back toe. Then I used a thinner gauge wire wrapped around to secure everything together and hold in a barely attached middle toe. This thinner wire also provided structure for the talons later on. Little middle feetsies. Go the back of the foot, going all the way through the body, tangle up here, and then split into 3 to be the heads that are capped by the beaks. Not only does this thin wire help hold everything together, this uneven wire wrap creates a great surface for the Apoxie skin to grip onto. Though I waited to apply it until I was satisfied with the feet's positioning, since Apoxie would lock everything in place. I knew that losing a bit of flexibility was worth it for a solid base, which I later refined with a Dremel to clean up and carve out the talons before adding a few details in. Now it's time to address the rather sad pillow wings. So let's get to wet felting by laying out different colored fibers, all facing the same direction on some bubble wrap, and then spraying them with soapy water. Next, roll it up and agitate it for a while. So we're not really aiming for a full wet felting. We're kind of just trying to get the fibers to stick together long enough so that we can run them through a sewing machine. Once unrolled, the colorful square can be laid onto a similarly sized piece of black felt and run through the machine with parallel lines about 1 inch apart. This allows me to cut the strips with the seam centered. So fun. This is why I went over every seam twice so it would lock in the thread and it doesn't like unravel because I cut it in the middle. I then cut the strips down to size and trimmed them into the shape of feathers. So I cut all the feathers to length so they're all rectangles, and now I'm cutting them into a more feather-shaped rectangle and then trimming the back that it's set on so that it has a little bit less opacity, I guess. So you can see through the feather a little better. I'm hoping that works well, but I still have something to attach to. With many of these in hand, I'm ready to assemble the wing, keeping a skewer in the wire pocket to prevent it from closing as I stabbed the felt repeatedly while felting the feathers to the base, just enough to hold them temporarily before eventually securing them with thread. I started with the bottom row of feathers extending past the edge of the wing pillow and then layered 3 more rows, which gradually built up the wing's texture and vibes. Time to look at the wings. Now all my base pieces were done, so I could finally get to the main event, which honestly took up about 60% of the build time. The beading. To tie a knot in hand sewing, wrap the thread around your finger and then roll it off, and then pull that chunky knot till it's tight. It can take a little bit to get the hang of, but it's the fastest, easiest way to tie a knot. I began with bugle beads, which ended up being a bit sharp on the ends, so they end up slicing through my thread. To counter this, I end up having to use button thread, which is so thick that it won't fit through beading specific needles. Well, that took a while. That's about 1,500 beads right there. Anyway, so that's the base layer. Time to add in some specifics. After going through an entire spool of thread and about 2,500 beads, I'm finally ready to move on to seed beads, which luckily are less sharp, which allow me to use a slimmer, longer beading needle with standard thread. I focus the seed beads mainly on the head and then use them to fill in the gaps between the bugle beads. Then I gave my little friends some sight by gluing glass eyes in place with a dab of glue and then filling out the surrounding area with more seed beads. Somewhere in the midst of this process, I remembered that the piece still needed to be painted, so crow, I pulled out the UV polish and applied thin layers of color, curing each layer under a UV light to avoid obscuring the details. Before adding a final top coat, I embellished the feet with rhinestones, held temporarily in place by B7000 glue. Then, I fully secured it down with the UV resin top coat. My goal with these rhinestones is to add a little structure and details in. To clean up the edges of my newly coated extremities, I added a little felt and sewed a few additional beads where needed, which was also the perfect time to add a few beads to the tops of the wings for a bit of a Starry Night vibe. Anytime this doll gets repositioned, the wings are probably the thing that's going to be repositioned the most and at the most extreme angles. And since we're using armature wire instead of something that's, actually meant to be repositioned like some sort of a ball joint, it eventually can break. This is not immortal wire. So by not integrating that wing wire into the body, in order to replace it, it's basically just resewing 100 beads. But if it was integrated with the rest of the body, it would be either a full redo or at least a very invasive surgery. The tail was made by repurposing some feathers originally made for the wings, sewing them onto a black felt backing and to each other to form the tail. I embellished it with additional beadwork and sewed a wire along its length so the tail would have a little shape and structure to it. I poked a small hole for the wire in the crow and inserted the tail and then secured it to the beaded doll using a curved needle. I then sewed a crossbar in before integrating the tail into the body by beading over the seam between the two with more bugle beads, and then gave the tail a little trim to clean everything up, and then gave the underside a beaded iridescent coating to really make it shine. Now I arrive at the final finishing touches for the wings. Remove the skewers from the wings and carefully slip them onto the structure wire before hand sewing the wings to the body of the crow. Because the back of the wing was rather messy from all of the intricate beadwork on the front, I cut out feather shapes from black felt to mimic the bottom row of the front feathers and then cut out another piece to cover the rest of the wing. I laid these felt pieces down in line with the corresponding feathers and then felted them to the back of the wing to temporarily hold it before sewing it in place. So there's been a change in plans, and now it turns out that the underside of the wings are going to be the stars of the show. So I guess that means it's back to beading. Noticing that the back of the wings looked a little too plain compared to the front, I added beads to the undersides, taking extra care that the thread wouldn't show on the top and look messy. Okay, see, this is what I mean when I say these beads are sharp. Is sometimes the end of the bead is broken and you're 1,000 beads in and you stop checking them so closely, and then you go to pull your string and your string just snaps, and then you have to try to figure out the last 2 beads that you sewed on so you can unravel them so you can tie off your string right there because it cut it flush. And this project has had a couple of setbacks, and let me tell you, that's been all of them. Finally, to complete the piece, I glued rare earth magnets to the feet using epoxy. These magnets, combined with the added weight in the bottom and the sturdiness of the feet, allow the crow to be magnetically attached to its display housing on the wall, which means that I can remove it for closer examination or to change its position without any fuss. By the way, if you're wondering what this display housing really is, it's a candle sconce for holding candles on your wall without burning your house down. And then, after more hours than I would care to admit, meticulously deciding the exact placement of over 4,000 beads, my new 3-headed friend, who I affectionately call Trey, is born. Not quite a crow, not quite a raven. I've been calling them Craven. Built like a maximalist doll with influences from traditions around the globe, I opted for a flexible fiber arts approach over a static sculpture. This sculptural art piece was my attempt to transform nighttime into a little friend. A tangible answer to the question, what if I gave that stained glass window a hug? And with that, there's another strange little creature out in the world. If you enjoyed watching this friend come together, stick around. There's always more where that came from. Thanks for watching, and don't be afraid to create weird, wonderful things just because you can. See you next time.